of this high evil. Incredibly, it is the mentality of Nazism. So who and what are the neocons really? The 911 Pentagon neocons, Wolfowitz, Prince of Darkness himself, Richard Pearl, Shalabi, Khalilzad, were all students and are followers of neocon chief philosopher Leo Strauss. They all studied under Professor Strauss at the University of Chicago, and Professor Strauss' ideology is even more extremist than his personal mentor and sponsor in Germany, Hitler's own legal theorist Carl Schmitt. The Schmitt-Strauss doctrine is that the state needs enemies and must create them if necessary, and must fabricate lies for the many, for the people, while its leaders, quote, embrace the darkness, unquote.
We also have to work, though, sort of the dark side, if you will. We've got to spend time in the shadows.
Leo Strauss taught that, quote, those who are fit to rule are those who realize there is no morality and that there is only one so-called natural right, the right of the superior man to rule over the inferior. This is from Leo Strauss and the American Right, a book published about Strauss's so-called philosophy in 1997. Leo Strauss's neocons literally brainstormed the attacks of 9/11 decades before those attacks. Attorney Stanley Hilton studied under Leo Strauss with Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl at the University of Chicago. Hilton's senior thesis under Strauss detailed a plan to establish a presidential dictatorship in the United States using a fabricated Pearl Harbor-like incident as its justification. Stanley Hilton, Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, Leo Strauss, and others discussed an array of different plots and incidents like September 11th and flying airplanes into buildings way back in the 1960s. And note that the book that Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense, passed out hundreds of copies of shortly before the 9/11 attacks was the 1962 book by top neocon Roberto Wolfstetter. The 9/11 neocons' mentor's mentor, therefore, was Hitler's own justifier of evil, Nazi Carl Schmitt. This is a quote from Professor Francis Boyle, an internationally renowned professor of international law at the University of Illinois. Quote, Schmitt was the most notorious Nazi law professor of his day, justifying every atrocity the Nazis inflicted on everyone. We're talking about the Holocaust. We must understand that these so-called neoconservatives are, in fact, neo-Nazis. They espouse the Nazi doctrine of Schmitt and Strauss and Machiavelli and Nietzsche, the doctrine of the Superman, unquote. This is what internationally acclaimed journalist Seymour Hersh had to say. Quote, we, that is the United States, has been taken over basically by a cult. 8 or 9 neoconservatives, we've seen they're really neo-Nazis in their mentality, have somehow grabbed the U.S. government. Just how and why they did it so efficiently, we'll have to wait for much later historians and for better documentation than we have now. But they managed to overcome the federal bureaucracy and the Congress and the press with the greatest of ease. This does say something about how fragile our democracy is, unquote. Lawrence Wilkerson, who was chief of staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell in the Bush-Cheney administration, about this same coup said, it's not a coup, it's worse. This is how retired 4-star U.S. Army General and top NATO commander Wesley Clark put it in a 2003 public address at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco.
What happened in 9/11 is we didn't have a strategy, we didn't have bipartisan agreement, we didn't have American understanding of it, and we had instead a policy coup in this country. A coup, a policy coup. Some hard-nosed people took over the direction of American policy, and they never bothered to inform the rest of us. Then I came back to the Pentagon about 6 weeks later. I saw the same officer. I said,
why haven't we attacked Iraq? We still going to attack Iraq? He said, oh, sir. He says, it's worse than that. He said, he pulled up a piece of paper off his desk. He said, I just got this memo from the Secretary of Defense's office that says we're going to attack and destroy the governments in 7 countries in 5 years. We're going to start with Iraq, and then we're going to move to Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. I sat on this information for a long time, for about 6 or 8 months. I was so stunned by this I couldn't begin to talk about it. And I couldn't believe it would really be true, but that's actually what happened. These people took control of the policy in the United States. And I realized then, it came back to me, a 1991 meeting I had with Paul Wolfowitz. You know, in 2001 he was Deputy Secretary of Defense, but in 1991 he was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. It's the number 3 position in the Pentagon. It was a pretty stunning thing. You mean the purpose of the military is to start wars and change governments? It's not to sort of deter conflict? We're going to invade countries? And you know, my mind was spinning. And I put that aside. It was like a nugget that you hold on to. This country was taken over by a group of people with a policy coup. Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld, and you could name a half-dozen other collaborators from the Project for a New American Century. They wanted us to destabilize the Middle East, turn it upside down, make it under our control. It went back to those comments in 1991. Now, did anybody ever tell you that? Was there a national dialogue on this? Did senators and congressmen stand up and denounce this plan? Was there a full-fledged American debate on it? Absolutely not. And there still isn't.
The truth is, our government was and still is penetrated and controlled by a Zionist Israeli 5th column that took over the White House, the Congress, the military-civilian superstructure, key military officers and intelligence personnel, and the mainstream media leading up to, on, and after 9/11. The level and extent of this penetration is unprecedented in the history of the world and amounts to a literal invasion by an un-American and hostile force. The same year, 2003, that General Wesley Clark gave that warning that the United States government, civilian superstructure of the military, key military officers and special operators and intelligence personnel had been taken over by an Israeli neocon 5th column coup, Israel's own Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon, frustrated that his Middle East destabilization and domination plan wasn't going as well and as quickly as planned, declared that the United States had already conquered Iraq. Remember Bush's famous false and absurd premature mission accomplished speech from the deck of a Navy ship that same year, 2003? Ariel Sharon went on that it was time that the U.S. marched against Libya, Syria, and Iran. Note that President Obama has made Sharon's Libya demand already a reality, that the U.S. is now destabilizing Syria by supporting none other than al-Qaeda-affiliated Syrian so-called rebels, and that the war drums are building now for an attack on Iran.